And we are starting on question number 33 tonight, which is James 1:13 says that God doesn't tempt us, but in 2 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 1, it says that God tempted David. How is this possible? And why does it say in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 1 that it was Satan that tempted David? Okay? So if you remember a couple of weeks ago, what we talked about with our last question was about the different details that are brought out in the Gospels. And sometimes these details seem to be at odds with other details, and sometimes they're very complementary. When you take a look at it, it's pretty easy to resolve some of the details that seem to be at odds with one another. In other words, in a lot of times, for example, in the Gospels, you're not going to have a contrary statement of one writer saying Jesus rose from the grave and another writer saying Jesus did not rise from the grave. You know, there isn't that sort of thing. It's just that there's a balance there. There are places in the Bible where it's a little bit more hard to kind of get around, and this is one of those things. But when you look at it, it really makes a lot of sense. Critics of the Bible are going to look at this and say, oh, see, the Bible's wrong because on the one hand it says this, on the other hand it says that, and so they conflict with one, they're contrary to one another. But like I said earlier, is that, you have one book of the Bible that is trying to present one point of view, and another book of the Bible that's, even though it's the same story, it's trying to have another agenda involved. And not that these two things are wrong, it's just that there's just one storyline that's being advanced, and there's another storyline that's being advanced over there. And so because there's these two different storylines that are going, you can sometimes have different details that when you look at them individually, it seems, when you compare them, it seems to be at odds with one another. But then when you start to put them into their contexts, it starts to say, oh, I see that it's, it resolves itself. And so when you look at these three different passages, you can kind of see, how at first glance, it kind of runs into each other, but hopefully we're going to straighten that out. So let's first of all take a look at James chapter 1 and verse 13 and take a look at that, and then we'll go back to the Old Testament, okay? So in James chapter 1 and in verse 13, this is what we've got. James chapter 1 and verse 13. It says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Okay? Now, let's understand what this word temptation means. Because, we understand what it means as far as, what it is. But, as far as looking at an actual definition of this word. This word in the Greek language really has to do with an examination. It has to do with a testing. And it is the same word that you see in verse number 2. If you look at verse number 2, it says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds. So that word trials is actually the very same word that is translated as temptations in verse number 13. And so you say, okay, well, here is, this temptation in verse number 13. In verse number 2 is trials. And these trials that we see in verse number 2 are things that God brings into the life of the believer in order to strengthen us and to give us perseverance and to mature us. And so that's the reason why those things are good and we should count it all joy. Okay? Well, in the Greek language, there's that one word and it's just an examination, it's a testing, and that could have good intent or it could have bad intent. And so here in James chapter 1 verse number 2, he's talking about an examination, a testing that has a good intent. In other words, these things come into our lives, and God allows them to come into our lives so that our faith can be tested and mature and brought out. But at the same time, what we've got in verse number 13 is what would be a bad intent. And that is, here is a temptation that is trying to get us to do evil. Now, what he's saying here is that God is not tempted by evil, and he doesn't want other people to be tempted by evil. And so what he's saying is that when we hit these periods in our life where, the testing is one of, are we going to do evil or are we going to do good? Not of what is good or what isn't good, but, it's a temptation of, let's be drawn off into evil. We need to understand that God doesn't do that. That isn't something behind God, okay? And so God doesn't tempt us because he doesn't want us to do evil, all right? So we've got that passage of Scripture. Now let's go back and take a look at these two Old Testament passages of Scripture and see how they kind of relate to it, okay? So first of all, let's take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 24 and verse number 1. 2 Samuel, way back in the Old Testament. Not that far way back, not like at the beginning of the Old Testament, but towards the front of the Old Testament. Okay, there we go. Chapter 24 and verse number 1. It says this, "Again the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them." Okay? So this word incited is probably where, the person who asked the question is thinking, this is temptation. There may be some translations that even translate it as tempted. I don't know. But we need to understand that this word incited is actually going to be a different sort of word than what we looked at over there in James chapter 1. James chapter 1, that is a right, stirs up. So in James chapter 1, it's talking about, it's a temptation of trying to get us to do evil. This is something that is going to be stirring up. And so here, it's a little bit different. I mean, it's very similar to one another, but it's a little bit different, and that is that the Lord is stirring David up to do something. And what it is to go and take a census of Israel and Judah. Okay? Now let's go take a look. Hold your place there and see what it is saying in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse number 1. So in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, and in verse number 1, notice that it says, Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel. Okay? And so that you're looking at, well, wait a minute. In 1 Samuel, it's saying David did, or 2 Samuel saying David did, or the Lord did. And then in 1 Chronicles, it's saying Satan did it. And so this does seem to be like something at odds, right? How can the Lord incite David to do this? And at the same time, how can Satan incite David to do this? Because the Lord and Satan are completely polar opposites to one another. Okay, well, understand that when you're talking about God and you're talking about Satan, that God is the ultimate authority about things, and that nothing goes on this earth without God, because he is the ultimate authority. I know that Satan is the god of this world, but at the same time, we do have, the Lord there. And when you look at, like, for example, the book of Job, you can see it. In the book of Job, you remember that Satan and the angels presented themselves before God, and Satan was with them. And God asked Satan, "Where have you come from?" And he said, "From roaming to and fro about the earth." And God asked Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the face of the earth, blameless." And so that led Satan to then start to lob accusations against Job. And also by lobbing these accusations against Job, he's lobbing accusations against God, because God just stuck up for Job. And so the Lord said, "Very well, you can do whatever you want to him." The first time he said, "But don't lay a finger on him." The second time he said, "Don't take his life." So you can see a little bit about how this is God working at the same time allowing Satan to work. Okay? So who was it that really afflicted Job? Well, Satan did, right? I mean, that was, Satan was the one that took away his wealth. Satan was the one that took away his family. Satan was the one that took away his health and everything like that. Okay? Satan did that. So Satan was there. But at the same time, the only way that Satan was able to do it was that God allowed it to happen. You say, okay, well, why did God allow it to happen? Well, because he had a plan and a purpose, and that is to give us the story of the book of Job so that we can understand a little bit about some of the things that go on in our lives too. Okay? So It's a pretty important thing for that to happen, even though Job didn't realize it at the time. So here we've got a situation where God will allow Satan to do things, and at the same time, God is allowing it for a greater plan and a greater purpose. And so it could be said that God did it, but at the same time, who really did it? Well, Satan does it, right? And so here we've got Satan inciting David to take this census of Israel, which was something that was a bad idea. As a matter of fact, it was such a bad idea that his commander Joab told him it was a bad idea. And Joab, when you go back and you look at Old Testament history, you see that Joab was really not all that good of a guy. I mean, he was a very scoundrelly, shady character, even to the point that when David died and gave advice to Solomon, he said, "You better watch out for Joab." Okay? So Joab was not, you could say, the moral standard. And so I guess a side note here is when you've got somebody who is not the moral standard, who is standing up and saying, this ain't right, you better look out, right? Because it isn't right. So what David wanted Joab to do was to take some men to go throughout the whole area. And by the way, it wasn't just Joab that opposed it. It was other military commanders too. But they were to go and count all the fighting men in Israel. Now, you say, well, what's so big a deal about that? Well, a couple of different things. Number one, there was something, I can't put my finger quite on it, but there is some sort of provision in the Old Testament that wasn't to be done unless it was by the Lord's direction. But number two, it's going to be something that, why does David really need to do this? I mean, at this point, he's kind of already defeated his enemies, and to go and take a census would be, for what purpose? The census of taking the age of military men is to, draft them, see how big of an army that you can have so that you can go out and wage war. Well, if the wars are already over, then why do you need the census? Could it just simply be so that you would be prideful of yourself and say, look how big and powerful of a person that I am? And so whatever the reason is that it was something that God did not want. I mean, it was something that was evil, but at the same time, God was allowing it to take place and allowing Satan to do it. So as the story goes on, Joab goes and does this. He really is not all that interested in doing it. As a matter of fact, there are some tribes that he didn't really count. We've got a discrepancy in 1 Chronicles to 2 Samuel as far as the number goes. And so you can kind of see that, maybe Joab really wasn't all that full-hearted into it, that maybe the results were kind of, skewered a little bit. Maybe it wasn't all that accurate. But when he came back with the results, David realized, I've sinned against God. And so he told God that he sinned against him. And then here comes Gad, the prophet, and saying, okay, David, you can pick your poison here. You can either have 7 years, let me see, I think it's 7 years, 3 years. This is in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse number 12. 3 years of famine, 3 months of being swept away before your enemies with their swords overtaking you, or 3 days of the sword of the Lord, days of plague in the land. Okay? So David, you get to pick the punishment. That's kind of like, when you were a kid, did your parent ever allow you to pick your punishment? That was the worst thing of all, wasn't it?
Don't give me a switch.
Yeah, so here's God saying, what do you want? Okay? Well, what David is and what he said was in verse number 13, David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. Let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is very great, but do not let me fall into the hands of man. And so David's choice was the third one, because the first one, and that is 3 years of famine, okay, months of being swept away, okay. Well, I guess famine could be in the hands of the Lord. But I'm going to put this in God's hand. I don't want to be put in man's hand, because that is something that David had already gone through, and it's something that he didn't want anymore. All right. So what happens is the Lord does send a plague on Israel, And we see that 70,000 men died from this plague. You know, we think that the coronavirus is bad, and I'm not saying it isn't bad, but 70,000 in a short area, in a short period of time, die from this. And what we see is that as the angel is coming to Jerusalem, that David is praying to God and asking God to have mercy. And so the Lord relents and tells the angel to stop. David sees this angel that is standing between the earth and heaven with a sword drawn, and what he is told to do is to go and buy the threshing floor of the owner where this angel had stopped in the land, and to make a sacrifice there to relent or to ask forgiveness for what was going on. And so that's exactly what David does, okay? So that's kind of the story. Now, you notice that it says in chapter 21, verse number 1, Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take this census, right? Now let's go back and take a look at 1 Kings. And 1 Kings, or excuse me, I'm sorry, 2 Samuel chapter 24. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, notice it says again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go take a census. And so who is this incitement directed toward? Is it towards David, or is it towards somebody else? Somebody else. It's towards Israel. Israel had done things against the Lord that the Lord was wanting to judge them for, okay? And so he's wanting to use this situation to do it. Now, I want you to notice that if you take a look at verse number, let me see, verse number 14 in 2 Samuel chapter 24, David said to Gad, I am in deep distress, let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men. Okay? Now, I read that verse over in Chronicles, and did you pick up the difference? There is a little bit of a difference there. Okay? So let me read verse number 14 again. It says, David said unto Gad, I am in deep distress, let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men. Now let's look at Chronicles chapter 21, and in verse number 13, David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. That's the same, isn't it? Let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is very great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men. Do you see the difference? Okay. The difference is between us and me. So what we see here is that in Chronicles, the emphasis is on who? It's on David, right? And so it makes sense that in chapter 21 and verse number 1, that Satan is inciting David, because Satan is actively doing the incitement, right? But in 2 Samuel chapter 24, who is the emphasis towards? Israel, because he says us. And so you can see that in chapter 24 and verse number 1, again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited. Okay? And so you see how there's little differences, and when you look at them on the surface, you think, hey, these really are contrary to one another. But when you start to dig into the context of it, you see, oh, that's what the writer of 2 Samuel is talking about, and this is what the writer of 1 Chronicles is talking about. God is doing something, looking at the big picture of things, and that is, number one, he's judging Israel for their sin. But number two, what is going to happen is that the place where David buys and sets up that sacrifice, that's where the temple is going to be built at, which is kind of interesting, because you've got a little bit of a parallel there of God's judgment coming on mankind, but you've got David who's coming up and he is offering up a sacrifice there to stop that judgment from proceeding. Okay, but David's not a priest. He's of the tribe of Judah, right? And so what is he doing offering up a sacrifice there? In fact, he's not offering up the sacrifice on the altar. He's making an altar and doing it there. Okay? So it's kind of like, that's interesting. But then again, who is of the tribe and the lineage of David? It's Jesus Christ, right? And Jesus Christ is our great high priest, even though he is not of the lineage of Levi. So it kind of is an interesting little storyline. All right, anybody have any questions or comments about that one?